G'day, campers. A very, very good evening to you all. It's Andy here. Another episode of the Professional Human Series, sponsored by Anywhere Auctions. First things first, my friends. I want to know how you guys are getting on out of 10. Post your scores in the comment section below. Let me know how you're going. Let me know how your weekend was. Did you have much success? Have you had any dramas? How is everybody feeling as we head towards the last month of the game in 2021? It has been pretty mental, I reckon. I don't know if there's one person that I haven't spoken to that is very much looking forward to the Christmas break. I think everybody is going like the clappers. I don't think many of us has worked quite as hard as what we're doing now. So, team, make sure you look after yourselves. All right, this is one of those times where tired mistakes can creep in, tired actions, shortcutting. Just make sure that you don't shortchange yourself or your reputation. All right, it's a bloody hard little stretch that we're going on now, right? And we're all trying to catch up. We're all trying to keep up. So please, gang, just make sure that you keep a track of yourselves. Make sure you get some sleep in. All right. Make sure that you get some rest in as best as you can. And just understand that you can only do what you can do. All right. You've only got so much time in the day. So I please encourage you just to bear that in mind, because we're taking on, all of us are taking on a heck of a lot right now. And I think lots and lots of us feel like we're sort of slightly limping towards the final stretch, but we can make it, team. So just make sure that you stay centered. Okay. Now, I've said this line a few times. Vulnerability is the key to true professionalism. And I'm very, very much firm on my belief around that. I do feel that without vulnerability, then you can't really take ownership of the things that you either don't know, the things that you do know, things that you're not sure about, questions that you don't know the answers to. It's really critical, right, that we think about vulnerability in how it transfers through all of the other things that we say that we are, whether we act with integrity, whether we're transparent. You can't be transparent unless you have a degree of vulnerability. Because what do you have? What do you do if you're not happy to be vulnerable with your weaknesses and your concerns or whatever? You're hiding them. Therefore, you're not acting with transparency. It's pretty logical when you think about it, right? If you're not sort of being open about the things that you don't know towards potential clients and what have you, and you try and BS your way around them, that is the absolute antithesis of transparency. Yet, I'm sure there'll be a few of you that will be saying it in the same breath. Okay, so, but the thing is, right, I got put well and truly in my place last week, in a very, very legitimate way. You know what? I was really glad that someone did put me in my place, and it was via a Facebook feed where someone posted a question in one of the real estate forums, and she is a single mom, has been a sales associate, about to kick into full-time sales, and wanted advice as to how to take it on. And I posted on there, be transparent about because she had concerns about juggling kids and kiddo and work and business and listing performances and all that sort of stuff, right? And I said to her, I just went down my normal path when it comes to vulnerability, because I hear way too many agents too afraid to sort of let on that they actually have a life outside of real estate. It's really sad that a lot of us feel that kind of pressure, right? When we don't feel that we can say to people that we're going to the footy, or that we are, or that we're taking our partners out for dinner or anything like that, right? So I posted an answer to a question around, just be open, be honest, be transparent, make no excuses around it, and own it, right? And I mentioned the example that I'm sure I've mentioned on here before about the fact that every other Wednesday I used to have a daddy-daughter day, and that's what I used to say to my potential vendors, that you could get hold of me 24/7 except before every other Wednesday, which is a daddy-daughter day. As I'm sure you can appreciate, Mr. and Mrs. Vendor, my daughter's more important than anybody else in the entire world. And that won me a hell of a lot. Not that I meant to do it, right? I didn't want to use my daughter to win favor, but because I was just being upfront and transparent and vulnerable in letting them see that I am a human first, that won me so much favor, by accident, right? It really, really did. So I mentioned that as a for example in this comment. And then I got pulled up by another lady who, and I won't name names, but I really appreciate them for what they did. She pulled me up and said, well, hold on, I'm a single mom as well. And I've experienced it on the other side where I've tried to be honest and I've just ended up being judged because I am a female, right? And it made me think, it made me sort of just take a step back. It put me on my heels a little bit because it made me sort of think about how vulnerability is represented when it comes to the genders, right? Now, in order to really ascertain that, we need to think about how we're being judged as males and females. Now, I'm not saying anything that I feel is out of turn or I feel is incorrect in any way, shape, or form. Yes, there will be generalizations as to how people perceive people. So don't take it personally to heart if it's not you, all right? If it doesn't apply to you, then great. But let's think about that for a second, right? And then let's try and translate that into how that comes across from a vulnerability point of view, because I still maintain, doesn't matter what bits you've got down below, vulnerability is the key to true professionalism, and I will maintain that fact. So let's have a think about what it means for both sides. Now, when we're being judged as guys or as girls, there's a hell of a lot of different. I mean, look, and I think that this is pretty much across any sort of race or demographic or what have you. There's generally, right, and I'm talking generally, so don't take offense, an assumption made around males and females, especially when it comes to things like children. Okay, and emotions and feelings and so on and so forth. Those sorts of things, soft things. When a guy expresses their emotions and their feelings, or like me, like what I did, talks about kids and so on and so forth, the general perception from society is one of, geez, that guy's so brave. That guy's such what a modern guy, what a great dad. Love how he's got his priorities in the right way. There's a lot of admiration and adoration for those guys, for the chaps that are happy to express emotion, right? That are happy to say that family comes first, all right? Because it goes against what society has as a perception of what a man's role is in a relationship, right? Historically speaking, guys were the hunter-gatherers, and the women were the ones inside the caves and all that sort of stuff, and looking after the young and blah, 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 blah. And that is really something that is just filtered all the way through society right to this very day, if we're being brutally honest about it, right? I know that there is a lot of chat around equality and all that sort of stuff, right? That's and that's really, really good conversation. Now, as an offshoot, do I think that sometimes it gets taken too far? Absolutely. But the general conversation around equality is something that really does need to be maintained in society, because everybody sort of tends to revert back to norm, right? We revert back to that. And we're not talking about conditioning for a certain demographic or a certain cultural background or whatever. We're talking about conditioning over millions of years, right? That we've got to try and address. So let's put it into a little bit of context here, right? So for me, vulnerability from a guy's point of view is in that admission, in that transparency around soft skills and all that sort of stuff, emotion, kids and so on and so forth, right? So in terms of how that translates into real estate talk, like like what I mentioned, my example of just explaining that every other Wednesday, daddy daughter day, that's when you're going to find it a little bit more difficult to get a hold of me, because clearly my daughter's my priority in my entire world. And that used to absolutely show a level of transparency beyond almost any of my competitors. And that's from what I was told as from vendors and what have you, right? The fact that I was just real about life and stuff. And that sort of endeared them to me. And like I said, I didn't really mean to do that. I was just being me. Now, on the girls' side of things, now on the lady side, and this is where I got pulled up, and this is what I completely agree with. Okay, so when I got pulled up on what I mentioned to this lady that was the single mom, when I got pulled up as perhaps not quite on the mark with what I mentioned, I completely understood, like 100%. And it's really annoying for me because my mom was a really, really strong, independent woman in a massively male dominated industry, right? She made it to the top of a man's world. So I've seen and heard and listened to experiences from someone as close to me as my mom around all this shit, right? Now, the stereotypical sort of response for ladies is, if a lady talks about emotions or feelings, or says they're feeling sad or whatever, then generally speaking, bosses, leaders, clients, whatever it is, it's a very different reaction when a woman says it as opposed to when a guy says it, right? So when a guy expresses their emotions about feeling sad or lonely or depressed or whatever, then they're seen as brave. But for women, and this kind of opens up to a much deeper conversation, but I'll keep it surface level for now. For women, if they start talking around those sorts of lines, the reality is they will get judged as weak. That's the reality. People might give it lip service, but there will be a DNA reaction to go, far out, this chick's fucking whinging again. And that's how it is. I'm not saying it's right, far from it. But the reality is, team, that if a female agent took my advice, right, in this instance, and said with a degree of transparency, I mean, look, I think it's different that you've got it organized, right? Where I've said every other Wednesday, yeah? And if I think it would still apply if a female said, look, every other Wednesday, I have a commitment with my children or with my daughter or son or whoever, that is every other Wednesday. So in that instance, please give the team at the office a shout. They'll be able to support. So I would think that anything that is regular is still absolutely fine from a transparency point of view. And I still think that applies to women and men, as providing that you've got some organization to support that, to cover that up, right? But if a female starts talking about kids too much, then let's have a think about what that perception is going to be from that potential client that they're trying to get the listing from. Ultimately, there'll be at least one of the couple, if it's a couple that whose home they're appraising, that will be like, oh, geez, is this chick got enough time? Seems to be too busy with the kids, and I don't know if they'll have time to look after me. Maybe we should just go with this guy. That sort of conversation is something that would be absolutely apparent in what's going on right now. Yeah. So what does vulnerability look like in guys and girls? So for guys, showing a bit of emotion, a bit more emotional intelligence and all that sort of stuff, absolutely relevant, I would think, in terms of vulnerability in the game of real estate. I'm not talking about, necessarily crying on the shoulder of your vendors or whatever, but, just making sure that, you are eloquent enough in your vernacular around emotion and things like that. So it makes them feel like you are a human being. On the female side of things, right? What does vulnerability look like from a professionalism point of view for women? Now, I've been mulling it over ever since I got pulled up on it, and like I said, I'm so glad that I did, to be perfectly honest, because it is a very different scenario for women in the main from a vulnerability point of view. Now, in terms of, like I said, in terms of transparency and showing a vulnerability, yeah, absolutely, it's still legit. Women will need to show a degree of organization behind any of that vulnerability that negates any concern that they're not going to be able to be focused enough on getting the job done. Okay. So for me, I think the vulnerability in women is, I think, in a number of instances, and I'm not saying this is happening all the time. Like I said, this is a general sweeping statement, but I think one of the reasons why a lot of women don't feel that they can be upfront, open, transparent, honest, vulnerable in their communications to their vendors is the fact that they have this fear of articulating emotion, right? Because of the general perception of society. So, for example, if you're working with a particular vendor, and this is very, very relevant to what's going on right now in the marketplace, right? And you're working with a particular vendor who is just not paying attention to what the market's trying to tell them. And they have got their heads so far in the sky with regards to price expectations and whatnot, and they are not listening to any form of logical reason or whatever the case may be. It'd be quite straightforward for a guy to say, look, I've got to be honest, I'm slightly frustrated by the position we find ourselves in here. To be honest, I feel that either something's gone on that I'm not sure about, or we're just not on the same page. Either way, we need to work this out in order to move forward together as a unit. So for a guy to say that, that's, for me, that's a very perfectly fine way of talking about, making that shift to get on the same page. But if a lady says that, I've got to be honest, Mr. and Mrs. Vendor, and this is talking as a female agent, I'm slightly frustrated with how things are going. How's that going to be taken? How is it going to be taken? It's going to be taken slightly differently, right? It would be, especially if it's an alpha male on the other end of the phone, right? It's going to be taken differently. So we need to have a think about this whole vulnerability topic when it comes to women, because society. And we're talking about, and I want to talk about vulnerability because women generally tend to have an easier time around expressing emotions and things like that to friends and so on and so forth. But it's almost like it's the opposite in business, because a man says it, shown as brave. A woman says it, she's shown as weak. Interesting conversation, right? And I think it's something that we need to explore further. And I think it's something that needs to be articulated a hell of a lot better, because even, and I'm talking about not just real estate here, I'm talking about across the entire game. Because I think at the minute, a lot of these conversations around vulnerability, around transparency, around being emotionally intelligent, all the rest of it, and I'm guilty of this as anyone else, but you look at the Gary V's, you look at any of the leading names or voices in the world, very few, if any, of the world leaders when it comes to this whole business landscape, that don't make that distinction. Like Gary Vee, for example, he's talked about vulnerability as well, and he makes these grand sweeping statements. But the facts of life are, the game is inherently different for guys than it is for girls, based on millions of years of conditioning. So we're going to have a think about that, right? So if you're a guy, then, then take my advice, like showing a bit of vulnerability is absolutely the key to true professionalism. For a female, I'd say the same thing, but you do have to be more wary about it. Now, transparency and whatnot, I think for me, this is where support comes into play a hell of a lot more. But at the same time, for a female, I think the vulnerability needs to come in the form of it needs to come in the form, for me, calling bullshit on the game, on the way the game's played. If I'm being honest, I'm just working through it right now as we talk. I actually think that vulnerability for women should be the fact that they have a DNA advantage from an emotional intelligence point of view, and therefore the way that they could be the way that they could be more expressive around that vulnerability is to be more open about the inherent inadequacies of the way that the game's been played up to now. There are some women, right? I mean, look, you look across almost any major franchise network, the vast majority of them in the top 10 will be women now. They'll be, there'll be a 50-50 split in the majority of those major franchise networks. I would like to hear more conversations around vulnerability from leading women in the game in a constructive way. Because I do feel that their key to showing true professionalism via vulnerability is getting them to understand, is getting potential vendors and clients and consumers and whatnot to understand that, yes, we have kids, yes, we have issues, yes, we have problems, but this is where the advantage of being a woman, I guess, comes into play. But we've still got our shit together, even though we've got that happening. Maybe that's the way forward. But this conversation around vulnerability and how it differs from males to females has to be had and highlighted to a greater extent. Because I fear that if women do take the lead of leading guys, me or whoever, then they might end up just getting painted with that standard woman brush of, geez, she's too busy with her kids to be dealing with our home. Because it's an easy assumption for people to make still, despite, all of the conversations around equality and what have you. Interesting, right? Have a think about it. I'd love you to have a think about what vulnerability means to you. What is your interpretation, your perception of vulnerability? How do you feel it is manifested in you? How do you feel you represent your vulnerabilities? Whether it's professionally, personally, whatever. I'd love to hear your comments. If you do have any thoughts around this, or if I'm just thinking too deeply into it. I don't think I am, though. Because the truth of the matter is, team, there's no amount of conversations around equality that are going to happen that's going to change in the short term the age-old caveman perception of the roles for men and the roles for women in the family when it comes to kids and things. It's shit. I agree. It's shit. It is, though. So we can either bitch and moan and say that it's not right, it's not right, it's not right, or we can highlight that it's wrong by showing our true professionalism. I think that'd be a better way to go. Anyway, campers, have a think about it, right? Because it's true. It's true. Something we need to talk about more. Stay safe, healthy, and happy, team. Talk to you soon.